Nobody warns you that the day you finally give your family everything they've ever asked for is the same day you find out exactly how little they think you are worth. I want you to remember that sentence because by the end of this story, you will understand it was not a complaint, it was a diagnosis. The departures hall at Charleston International smelled like burnt coffee and jet fuel, the particular perfume of people trying to convince themselves they are happy. I stood beside 6 matching pieces of luggage, new, hard-shelled, the tags still swinging, and I did not need to check the receipt to know what they cost, because I was the one who had paid for them, the same way I had paid for everything else about this trip, business class seats on Air France. 5 nights at the Hôtel de Crillon on the Place de la Concorde, the kind of hotel where the doormen wear top hats and pretend not to notice when a man your age is left standing at the curb. A private reservation at Le Jules Verne, the restaurant that sits inside the iron latticework of the Eiffel Tower itself, 1,100 feet above the city, where you cannot get a table without your name already typed onto a list 3 weeks in advance. $80,000, all told. I know the number because I wrote the checks myself, one at a time, the way I have written every check of my life, with my own hand, for my own family, without once being asked to explain myself. My son Preston had pitched it to me over dinner 2 months earlier with the kind of performance he'd clearly rehearsed. "Dad, you built everything with your hands. You've never once seen Paris. Let me give you that." I remember how my chest had actually ached with pride, hearing my boy talk about giving me something for once. I did not yet understand that a gift wrapped that carefully is sometimes just a trap with better packaging. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, was fussing over Sophie's travel dress for the 3rd time. The kind of nervous, overbright energy a person generates when they are performing normalcy for an audience. My grandson Grant kept asking if the Eiffel Tower was taller than our house. Preston wasn't looking at any of us. His eyes were fixed on the departure board, his foot tapping against the tile in a rhythm that had nothing to do with excitement. I was the only still thing in that terminal. We reached the counter. The agent, a young woman with a company scarf and a tired professional smile, took the passports one at a time. Preston's, Vanessa's, Grant's, Sophie's. She printed their boarding passes, slid them across the counter, and then reached for mine. Her fingers paused over her keyboard. "Sir," she said, glancing up, "I'm not showing a reservation under your name on this flight." The sentence didn't make sense yet. It just hung there, a collection of sounds with no shape. I turned to my son. A simple, wordless question on my face, the kind a father doesn't think he'll ever have to ask his own child. And Preston, the boy I had taught to swing a hammer before he could tie his shoes, would not meet my eyes. He was staring at a scuff mark on his shoe like it held the answer to a question no one had asked. "Preston," I said. Quiet, but it cut through the terminal noise like a chisel through soft pine. And that's when he said it. Not with shame, not even really with cruelty. He said it the way you'd correct someone about a reservation at a restaurant. "Dad, look, you're not on the list. I don't know what happened, but there's nothing I can do about it right now. The flight's boarding in 20 minutes. "You're not on the list, Dad," Vanessa gasped, right on cue, a hand fluttering to her chest. Oh my goodness, there has to be some mix-up. Already pulling out her phone to perform the search for a solution she had no intention of finding. Her face fell into practiced disappointment. Walt, a last-minute seat is nearly $4,000, and it wouldn't even be near us. That's just criminal. They stood there, my son and his wife, a united front of manufactured regret, and I understood in the space of about 4 seconds that I was watching a performance 2 people had built together, probably in a hotel room, probably while I was writing the check for their trip. Preston put a hand on my shoulder. It did not feel like affection. It felt like a hand closing a door. "Look, Dad, why don't you just head home, get some rest? We feel terrible. We'll bring you back something incredible from the trip. Just go home. Go home," like a child sent to his room, like an inconvenience being tidied off the floor before the guests arrive. I looked at my grandchildren's confused little faces. I looked at the 6 pieces of luggage I had paid for. I looked at the life I had built for this man, the tuition, the down payments, the safety net stretched under every fall he had ever taken. And in return, he had given me 2 words at an airport counter, in front of strangers, with my own grandchildren watching. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I gave my son a long, level look, the kind that used to make him confess to broken windows when he was 9 years old. And then I nodded once. All right, son. Have a safe flight. I turned and walked away without looking back. I could feel the exhale of relief at my spine. They thought the awkward part was over, that the old man had absorbed his humiliation quietly and gone home to lick his wounds. They had no idea they had just watched me start walking to work. The cab ride home cut through Charleston's old grid of live oaks and iron gates, streets I'd known my whole life looking somehow foreign through the window glass. I caught my own reflection layered over the passing houses. For one flickering second, I saw a tired old man with airport lights still stitched around his eyes. Then the feeling passed, and what looked back at me instead was a man who had simply, finally seen clearly. Go home. The words had stopped being my son's voice. They had become my own instruction to myself. This is the part people misunderstand about men like me. We do not explode. We do not need to. The sharp, hot sting of that airport counter had already cooled into something colder and far more useful by the time the cab turned onto my street. The quiet, settled weight of a tool sliding into a craftsman's palm. This was not a family argument anymore. This was a structural problem, and structural problems have solutions. My son and his wife had made a fatal miscalculation. They had looked at a 70-year-old man standing at a check-in counter and seen a wallet to be managed, an inconvenience to be parked at the curb. They had forgotten they were speaking to the man who built, plank by plank, board by board, the very foundation their comfortable lives stood on. They thought they were playing against a pawn they could sacrifice for a better position. They had no idea they were sitting across the board from the man who owned the board. The house was silent when I let myself in, holding the particular hush of a home that knows something has shifted. I walked past the mantle of family photographs and into the front room, where I sat down in the armchair by the window. Nora's chair, the one with the faded floral print that had spent 30 years soaking up morning sun. In the quiet, I could almost hear her. Nora saw the fine cracks in people before the rest of us noticed the break. Years ago, after Preston had begged for a loan for a car he didn't need, she'd sat with me on the porch watching him drive off. He has your hands, Walt, she said, not looking at me. But he doesn't have your patience for the grain. He only wants the finished table. I hadn't understood it then. I thought it was a mother's worry. Now, sitting in her chair with the airport still burning in my chest, her words rang like a struck bell. She used to say, "Money doesn't change a man, Walt. It just shows you more clearly who he already was." I had spent the 2 years since her funeral mistaking my own generosity for love, when in truth it had simply been fuel. Fuel for a weakness in my son I had refused to name, because naming it would have meant admitting I had raised him wrong somewhere along the way. This was no longer about a missed flight. This was about the foundation Nora and I had spent 40 years laying, board over board, and I was not going to stand in this house and watch my own blood take a crowbar to it for the price of a vacation. I walked into my study, the one room in the house that was mine alone, lined floor to ceiling with books on joinery and low-country history, smelling permanently of sawdust and lemon oil. The desk was dark walnut, the very first piece I ever built for this house, 41 years ago. I ran my palm over its surface, feeling the grain the way I have felt it 10,000 times. I picked up the phone and dialed the number I have never needed to look up. Voss in Whitfield. Nathaniel. It's Walt Calloway. A brief pause, then his tone warmed with genuine concern. Walt, good to hear your voice, though something in it tells me this isn't a social call. I need you to draft an immediate freeze on all trust access for Preston effective right now, today. A beat of typing. Understood. What's the basis? A full reassessment of the trust's terms and beneficiaries. That'll do for a starting filing. When do you want the notification sent to Preston? This was the part that mattered. In the next 5 minutes. He's on a flight to Paris right now. 9 hours in the air. Phone off. I want that notice to be the very first thing he sees when he lands and turns his phone back on. Nathaniel didn't ask why. He understood the geometry of what I was building without needing it explained. "Consider it done, Walt." I set the phone back in its cradle and pictured, somewhere over the Atlantic, a quiet little email already climbing into a queue waiting for a single moment 9 hours from now to detonate. It hadn't started at that airport counter. That was just the final brick falling off a wall that had been crumbling for years. And once I let myself remember, the memories came back with the sting of a splinter working its way to the surface. There was a Sunday dinner, a few months after Nora's funeral, the house still wrapped in the particular silence grief leaves behind. Vanessa had gestured toward the glass case in my study, where I kept a small collection of hand tools that had belonged to my own father and grandfather. A set of chisels, a brass-plated block plane, things with no market value and enormous personal weight. "Walt," she'd said, admiration dripping from every syllable. "Those are basically history. You should have them appraised." I explained what each one meant. The plane my grandfather had carried off a boat from Charleston Harbor in 1911. The chisels my father had used to build our first church pew as a free man's son. That's when Preston leaned in, his business voice on. "Dad, honestly, they're just sitting in a case. They're assets. There's a guy I know does high-end restoration sales. If I could borrow the plane for a private client meeting just to show provenance. It's about leveraging what we have. Leveraging. Assets. Cold words for things that held my whole bloodline. "Son," I said gently, "these aren't for leveraging. They're for remembering. They stay here." The charm drained off his face instantly. He picked at his fruit the rest of the night like a 40-year-old man denied a toy, and didn't speak to me again until he needed something else. If the tool case was the first crack, Vanessa's boutique was the flood that followed. She called it her passion project, a curated online shop for imported scarves and jewelry. It lasted 7 months. The end of it arrived as a frantic phone call from Preston, and that evening Vanessa sat on my sofa without a stitch of makeup, red-eyed, playing the part of a woman with nothing left. "I'm so ashamed, Walt," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen. I've let Preston down." I wrote a check for $65,000 to clear her supplier debts and her card balances. She wept into my shoulder and swore, hand over heart, she would pay back every cent. 4 days later, I was stopped at a red light on King Street and watched her walk out of a boutique with a shopping bag from a store where the price tags carry commas, laughing into her phone, glowing, not a trace of the broken woman from my living room. I had not rescued her from a crisis. I had simply financed the next chapter of her indifference. The tool case was a test. The $65,000 was a rehearsal. But the real target, the one they had been circling for over a year, was the Calloway family trust. Nora and I had built it from nothing. The accumulated sweat of 40 years of custom cabinetry and hand-turned staircases installed in half the historic home south of Broad Street. It was never meant to be spending money. It was meant to be a legacy, something waiting for Preston after I was gone. Not a checking account he could dip into while I was still standing in front of him. The questions had started small. "Dad, is the trust revocable or irrevocable? Just curious. Then, is there a provision for early disbursement, for a real opportunity, not a whim?" He circled it the way a man tests ice, one careful footstep at a time, and every time I gave him the same answer. "The trust is for your future, son, not your present." Sitting at my desk that night, the pieces I refused to connect finally clicked into a single ugly shape. The persistent questions about disbursement. The sudden generous proposal for an $80,000 family trip. The insistence that I pay for every piece of it up front. The airport counter. It was never a family vacation, it was bait. Get the old man somewhere far away, relaxed, disoriented by champagne and jet lag, and more agreeable to signing whatever papers were waiting for him. And when I proved harder to move than they expected, leaving me at the counter wasn't a mistake. It was Plan B, delivered with a shrug. Even if we can't get the signature, we're still entitled to the trip. The next morning, Otis Grant, who has run my shop for 30 years and has never once asked me for a thing beyond a fair wage, found me in the workshop before I'd even opened the front gate. "Walt," he said, wiping sawdust off his hands, Preston came by the shop last month while you were at the lumber auction. Asked me, casual like, how the business valuation worked for trust purposes. Didn't think much of it at the time. Think you should know now. I thanked him. Men like Otis are rarer than good lumber, and I don't forget who tells me the truth when it costs them nothing to stay quiet. Nathaniel Voss's office sat on the 11th floor of a converted cotton warehouse on East Bay Street, all exposed brick and quiet ambition. I laid it all out on his desk, not as a grieving father's complaint, but as a case. The tool case incident establishing a baseline. The $65,000 bailout, with a printed photograph of Vanessa's shopping bag beside it. The persistent trust questions, recounted word for word. And finally, the airport. Nathaniel set down his pen and laced his fingers together. Walt, let's speak plainly. You came in here thinking about reinforcing a cracked foundation, but a good builder, and you know this better than anyone, finds the cause of the crack before he patches it. From what you've described, this isn't a crack from time or pressure. This is a crack from poison mixed into the concrete from the start. The metaphor landed exactly where he meant it to. If we just bolt new safeguards onto the existing trust, he continued, you're putting a stronger lock on a door your son has already proven he's willing to burn down. You'll spend the rest of your years in a permanent siege, defending your own competency, your own life's work. A permanent siege. That was precisely what my life had quietly become. What I'm suggesting, Nathaniel said, isn't defense. It's a complete change in the nature of the legacy. We don't just protect the money. We put it somewhere it can never be reached, corrupted, or manipulated again, and somewhere it does more good than it ever would sitting in an account waiting to be raided. I looked out his window at the church steeples and old rooftops of a city I had spent my whole life building things inside of. And I thought about the kind of foundation my son was constructing his life on top of, one made of entitlement and appetite. And then I thought of a different kind of foundation entirely. Give me a moment, I said, and dialed my niece. Imani answered on the second ring, bright and unguarded. Uncle Walt, good timing, I just got out of studio. No performance in her voice. No hidden angle. We talked about her semester and then about her final thesis project. A community design center for elderly residents in the East Side neighborhood, built from reclaimed heart pine, oriented for natural cross-ventilation the old Charleston way. She lit up describing it. She wasn't asking me for anything. She was simply proud of something she was building. You've got that fire in you, I told her. Just like your Aunt Nora. Tell me something. You remember what she always said was the most important part of any structure? She didn't hesitate. The part you can't see. The character of the builder. I closed my eyes. That was the answer. You make me proud, Imani. You'd make her proud too. I hung up, set the phone face down on Nathaniel's desk, and felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as peace. Let's do it, I told him. Dissolve the Calloway family trust completely. In its place, rebuild something new. Call it the Eleanor Calloway Foundation for Design. Its sole purpose, full 4-year scholarships for promising students of color pursuing degrees in architecture and design, right here out of the Low Country. And when the time comes, I want the position of executive director offered first to my niece, Imani Calloway. Nathaniel picked up his pen, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was building something instead of guarding it. 9 hours and 4,000 miles away, Paris was performing exactly as advertised. Preston and Vanessa stepped out of Charles de Gaulle into that particular golden light the city is famous for, and by the time their car pulled up to the Creon, Vanessa actually sighed out loud with pleasure at the sight of the lobby. Gilded columns, orchids, the murmur of a string quartet somewhere out of sight. Preston, feeling expansive, pulled out his phone the moment they connected to the hotel Wi-Fi, ready to post a photo of the lobby chandelier with some caption about finally relaxing. Instead, notifications flooded the screen all at once, and buried among them was an email from Voss and Whitfield with a subject line that made his stomach drop before he'd even opened it. At the marble check-in desk, the concierge asked for a card for the incidentals hold. The platinum card linked directly to the trust, the one with what he assumed was a limitless ceiling. She swiped it. A small, polite frown. She swiped it again. I'm so sorry, monsieur. It appears this card has been declined. Declined. A word from a foreign language, meant for other people, not for him. I wasn't there, of course, but sitting in my study I could picture it with total clarity. The color draining from my son's face. Vanessa's manicured nails digging into his sleeve. Her whisper turning venomous in his ear. My phone lit up with the first text an hour later. Dad, weird issue with the card, probably a fraud flag. Can you call the bank? I set the phone face down and kept reading. 10 minutes later, Vanessa, Walt, they won't give us the room key. The kids are exhausted. Fix this. I didn't answer. The call started soon after. Preston's name flashing, ringing out to voicemail. Then again 2 minutes later, then Vanessa's name vibrating furiously against my desk. The texts sharpened into panic, then into accusation. Why aren't you picking up? Did you do this on purpose? Is this some kind of joke? And finally, unmistakably, Vanessa, how could you do this to your own grandchildren? You are a cruel, selfish old man. You stranded us. I was in my workshop that whole evening, restoring a small three-legged side table I built for Nora on our first anniversary. Its surface gone dull with decades of dust. My phone buzzed against the workbench like something trying to escape. I let it ring. 19 missed calls. 31. 54. Every buzz was a demand aimed not at their father, but at their banker. They weren't frightened for me. They were frightened for their access. And beneath that fear, watching the cherry wood come back to its color under my hands, I felt something close to peace. I was not punishing them. I was teaching them, in the only language that had ever truly reached either of them, the meaning of the word consequence. It took them 4 days to get home from Paris. 4 days of canceled connections, a red-eye through Reykjavik, and the slow, humiliating grind of a self-inflicted exile. I knew the moment they arrived. The car door slammed with a particular fury, and their footsteps on my porch were heavy with a rehearsed indignation. They didn't knock. They pushed straight through the front door mid-sentence and stopped dead in the entryway. Nathaniel Voss was seated calmly in the armchair across from mine, a leather folder resting on his knee. They had come expecting to corner a lonely old man. They found a lawyer waiting to open a proceeding. "What is this?" Preston finally managed, gesturing wildly. "You freeze our accounts, you leave us stranded on the other side of the ocean with your grandchildren, and now you bring a lawyer into your living room? We were worried sick. All of this over an honest mistake at a check-in counter." Vanessa recovered her composure and slid smoothly into her role. "It was the single most humiliating experience of our lives, Walt. To have to explain to our own children why we were sleeping in an airport lounge. Do you have any idea what you put us through? Over your feelings being a little hurt?" I let the storm break against my silence until it had nothing left to say. Then I spoke, quietly, and it cut cleaner than shouting ever could. "Are you finished?" I nodded to Nathaniel. He slid the folder across the coffee table without a word. "You seem to believe," I said. "This is about a forgotten reservation." I laid down the first document, a bank record. "This is a transfer of $65,000 from my account to cover Vanessa's boutique debts." Beside it, I placed the printed photograph, the shopping bag, the laughing face. 4 days after the tears on my sofa, her jaw went rigid. Then, one by one, canceled checks, a decade of quiet subsidies laid out like a paper trail of dependency. A car down payment, property taxes, club dues, school fees. You call the airport a simple mistake. I call it the final, arrogant withdrawal from an account you've been emptying for 5 years. I let the silence hold. Then I nodded once more. "There's one more thing," I said. "Mistakes aren't planned in advance." Nathaniel drew out a single printed page. "This is a copy of an email sent from Preston Calloway to Vanessa Calloway 10 days before the trip. Subject line, Paris payout plan." He read from it, his voice flat and merciless as a level laid across a warped board. "Once we get him relaxed at the Crillon, a few glasses of wine, and he'll be far more agreeable about signing the disbursement papers. The 80 grand is steep, but the trust payout makes it worth it." Nobody moved. The color didn't drain from their faces. It fled, leaving something gray and waxy behind. Vanessa rose first, unsteady, and looked toward the front door like it was a shore she needed to swim to. Preston stood frozen, staring at the printout, and when he finally lifted his eyes to mine, I saw no apology in them, only the vast, hollow ruin of a man who had gambled everything on one dishonest hand and lost. They left without another word. The door didn't slam. It clicked shut, softly, final. There was no triumph in me, just the deep, settled quiet of a storm finally finished passing through. Weeks went by in a silence that, for the first time in years, felt like healing instead of loss. I met Imani at a small coffee shop on Broad Street and slid a new folder across the table. This one a deep, hopeful blue. She opened it, confused, then went still as she read the header. The Eleanor Callaway Foundation for Design. I told her everything. The mission, the scholarships, the idea Nora had always cherished, that the most beautiful thing a person could ever build was a door someone else could walk through. Uncle Walt, she whispered, tears nothing like the performed kind I'd watched in my living room weeks earlier. This is everything she was. A foundation needs a strong custodian, I told her. Someone with vision and integrity, who understands the character of the builder matters more than the size of the house. When you graduate, I want you to be its first director. I'm not offering you a job, Imani. I'm handing you a legacy. The public unveiling came 2 months later at the Charleston Preservation Society's annual gala, held in the ballroom of a house I had restored the staircase for 30 years earlier. I stood at the podium and announced the Eleanor Callaway Foundation for Design to a room of 200 people, the local paper's camera flashing, and named Imani as its founding director. Preston and Vanessa were there, seated near the back, invited, deliberately, because some things need to be witnessed in the open air to become permanently, irreversibly real. I watched my son's face as the room applauded, and I understood he finally grasped that this was not a wound that would heal quietly behind closed doors. It was public. It was done. It could not be undone. I'm back in my workshop most evenings now. The house holds a different kind of quiet than it used to. Not the heavy silence of absence, but the still, clean quiet of peace. For years, I believed my legacy was a number in an account, a net I was weaving to catch my son no matter how far he fell. I've come to understand you cannot build a safety net for a man determined to cut every rope himself. Preston and Vanessa looked at my life's work and saw a vault to be cracked. They never once understood that the true value was never in the money. It was in the dignity of the work itself. They wanted the finished table. They scorned the wood, the tools, the calloused hands that shaped it. A true legacy isn't what you leave for people. It's what you leave inside them. What Preston wanted was an inheritance. I have finally learned the difference between that and a legacy, and I built the second one instead. My own work isn't finished. I'm planning a trip of my own, not to a hotel with a guest list, but to Gorée Island off the coast of Senegal, to walk the ground my family's hands came from before they ever picked up a chisel on this side of the ocean. I spent my whole life building a home. It felt like time to go see where home first began. I didn't do any of this for revenge. I did it for something you cannot put a price on. I did it for my own self-respect, because dignity is the one house a man must build for himself, and he must never, under any circumstance, hand anyone else the keys.